Tim, Melissa, and I want to welcome you to what will be a second intellectually exciting semester of lectures and seminars that comprise our Mellon Sawyer Seminar. Our year-long seminar, Cultural and Textual Exchanges, the Manuscript Across Pre-Modern Asia, Eurasia, has been funded and supported by an array of people and institutions to whom we are grateful. Most obviously, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation provided the large grant that sustains this project. But there are others, sine quibus non, whom it is my pleasure to acknowledge today. The Rare Book School at the University of Virginia has helped subvene some of the visitors who are lecturing in the series. At the University of Iowa, we have received crucial help from numerous dedicated people in several offices: the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Graduate College, the University Center for the Book, the Office of the Executive Vice President and Provost, and last but not least, the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies and the Office of the Vice President for Research and Economic Development. Without the director of the Obermann Center and her assistants, and without the Vice President for Research and Economic Development and staff members in his office, this seminar would never have come into being. They issued the call for proposals, and when this proposal was selected, shepherded it to success in the Mellon Foundation competition. Our talented colleagues at the Obermann and in the Vice President's office have assisted us every step of the way since then, and believe me, there are many steps. We are delighted that the Vice President for Research and Economic Development, Dan Reed, is himself here today and will introduce our first speaker. Disciplines across the entire spectrum benefit from Vice President Reed's creative and multidimensional approaches to encouraging the life of the mind at this university. Please join me in thanking Vice President Reed for his and his office's invaluable work on our behalf as we welcome him to our podium.
Well, I'm delighted to be here and to welcome you. This is an interesting cultural connection in lots of ways because as a computer scientist, Brent is part of my people, my tribe. But the title of this series is also apt because it's really about cultural traditions and bridges, and I think this talk will really exemplify that as we look at how technology has illuminated and brought insights from ancient manuscripts. And so I look forward to a fascinating talk. But this kind of intersection across disciplines and the vibrant scholarship that it creates is really the hallmark of what a great research university is about. It's about bringing people together within disciplines, but also across disciplines, to look at old ideas in new ways, and sometimes new ideas in old ways, and certainly new ideas in new and interesting ways. And that's what I'm confident this talk will be about. I was telling Brent that I was reading the Science article about the technology associated with reading the scrolls last night. It's a fascinating piece of work for a computer scientist, but I think it will be a fascinating story as well from a cultural and humanities perspective. So without further ado, let me introduce Brent Seals. He's a professor of chair of computer science, director of the Center for Visualization and Virtual Environments at the University of Kentucky. He earned his PhD in computer science just up the road at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1991. And as if it weren't clear already, will be abundantly clear in a few moments, his research program centers on computer visualization and vision applied to challenges in the digital restoration of antiquities. So with that, let me welcome Brent to the podium.
Thanks very much, Dan. It's great to meet you and know you're part of my people and I appreciate being invited to this series and also your support of what's going on here. We had breakfast at the Bluebird Cafe, so I think I've gotten a little of the local color. I'm ready to get started. I'd like to say, based on my title slide, Digital Unwrapping, Homer, Herculaneum, and the Scroll from En-Gedi, I'm going to give you today a little bit of retrospective, some storytelling, actually. And most people, when they see this slide, the first thing they ask is, where is Kentucky? So I thought I'd go ahead and start with that and just let you know that we're almost neighbors. And Kentucky isn't necessarily known to be a hotbed of work with Dead Sea Scrolls or things from the Dead Sea or Herculaneum. But I've been fortunate over the last 2 decades to carve out a place at the University of Kentucky for some of this work in computer science and in conjunction with humanities scholars, and that has culminated for me in an article that came out just last September in Science Advances. And you can find this online because it's an open source journal, which is another thing that computing has really been pushing forward. And that means that you're able to go ahead and find this article, even if you don't have a library, and read it in its entirety, because we went ahead and paid the fee for it to be available open source worldwide, which I think is really pretty cool. It also did appear in the conventional press, so some of you may have seen the New York Times article that featured our photo, which is not a photo. This is actually a digital unwrapping of something that doesn't actually exist because the physical object's not been opened. It appeared on the front page of the New York Times. And I'm also delighted to say that we were featured on the Drudge Report, which was a life list for me, under Scanning Software Deciphers Ancient Biblical Scroll. So I was unaware that the software did that. But and I also realized that we may be eligible for a Nobel Prize, because if we read what's inside a Herculaneum scroll, that would be literature. And it seems like they've lifted some of the rules about what it means to win a Nobel Prize. Anyway, those are my jokes for the day to get us started on what I'm going to call the world of damage. When I started out my computer vision career in the 90s, digital libraries were a nascent part of what was happening at the time. And by the late 90s, there was big investment from the National Science Foundation and others to try to make things become digital so that then we could do really interesting things with those digital objects. And I started out in that milieu until I realized that there are actually a lot of things out there that are hard to do the very first step on, which is make them digital. They're so badly damaged that making them digital in the first place becomes a really, really difficult task. And that became, in the late 90s, one of my focus areas of my research was to say, how can we take things that are badly damaged, make them digital so that subsequent processing, analysis, possibly even restoration can happen? What you're seeing here is one of the drivers for me in the early to mid-2000s, and I'll talk a little bit about it during this talk. It is a Herculaneum scroll, and this one in particular is housed at the Institut de France in Paris. It's one of 2 intact scrolls from the Bay of Naples that has never been read and never been physically opened. I'm also going to talk this morning a little bit about the scroll from En-Gedi, pictured here. This scroll was found in the floor of an excavated Byzantine synagogue on the shore of the Dead Sea in a town called En-Gedi. And 40 years ago, that discovery piqued the curiosity of a set of archaeologists and conservators who were unable to move forward with this artifact because of its damaged state. So it sat for 40 years in an archive until we were given the chance to work on it 2 years ago, and I'll talk about that in my talk today. So I'm going to take an approach that may be different for some of you who are humanities scholars, because I'm not going to talk so much about the text, the story, and the significance of interpreting all of that. Rather, I'm going to speak mainly geometrically today. So I'm going to try to talk about geometry and computation and how we've harnessed that to be able to get to the place where we can talk about text and stories. So I'm going to start with part 1, and I call this layers. If you want to imagine the geometric sequence, we'll go from flat to wrinkled to 3D. Okay, so part 1, layers. One of my early projects was to make digital copies of manuscripts, and in particular, we wanted to go after manuscripts that were highly inaccessible so that scholars who didn't have access would be able, through technology, to do scholarship remotely with the internet, and to be able to see on those artifacts things that would be difficult to see with the naked eye, even if you had it right in front of you. So we were able to work on the Venetus A, which is in the Marciana Library in Venice. If you can imagine how horrible it must have been for me and my team to spend several weeks in Venice working on this project on the Plaza San Marco, you know. We were able to go and be a part of a team to make a digital facsimile of the Venetus A, which is the oldest complete copy of Homer's Iliad. And, you know, the Iliad, well, if you really want to know the story, I think Brad Pitt, it was in a movie that does tell the story. There was one facsimile of the Venetus A, pictured here. It had been made by an Italian photographically in 1901 by the name of Comparetti, and there were really only 5 or so copies of this facsimile available worldwide. And what we wanted to do in conjunction with Harvard University was to build a facsimile that was digital, higher resolution, and could provide things for scholars, if you see this region of interest, like color, because in 1901, color photography did not exist, and it turns out that these cues are really important for scholarship. So what I discovered in working on this, making digital facsimiles, is that the power of layers is very, very important for visualization and for scholarship. Here's an example of an image from Comparetti on the Venetus A, and I've juxtaposed our color. And you can see that viewing those two things in layers, one on top of the other, aligned, registered, gives you a powerful sense of what's different between the two, what's the same, and what may have changed over time. We found some surprising things, actually, when we did this project. Here's on the left a blow-up of a small section of the illumination on one page of the manuscript, and on the right, the same illumination from our facsimile, our digital facsimile, and you see that our facsimile is actually much poorer, even though it's higher resolution, and that's because in the 100 intervening years from Comparetti, things disappeared. And when you put these things one on top of the other and fade from one to the other as layers, you get a strong sense of what it is that's disappearing, what it is that's still there, and you also generate this sort of time lapse through layers, which is really, really interesting. And you know, I had played with this before I did the Iliad work. In fact, just an aside by way of inspiration, I'd like to acknowledge Cheryl Seacrest, who in the early 2000s, once I became a little bit known for trying to work on damaged material, she sent me this one-page letter by way of a cold call and said, "Dr. Seals, would you be able to find a way to restore this letter? It's from my father, and I've had it displayed, and you can see that it's badly faded." So we tried a bunch of things and ultimately found a digitization and then a color transform that it was able to pull out the text to a degree strong enough that we were able to do a complete restoration. And I want to show you that restoration as I fade up from the original to the restored result, which we then provided to Cheryl as a gift. So here goes. There's a lot of work by hand. What I'm doing is just fading this up on top for you. But in the end, everything was perfectly readable, and we were able to answer the challenge, which was, what does this letter actually say? What's it about? Because in a pretty canny and shrewd way, Cheryl did not tell me what the letter said and how meaningful it was. She just said that she wanted a restoration. Well, it turns out this was a letter from her father to her when she was a little girl, and he was on landing ship tank 450 in the Pacific, and he didn't know if he was going to be coming home to his little girl. He wrote her this letter, and she's cherished it all those years. And he closes the letter by saying, "Be a good girl, oceans of love, your daddy Frank." I mean, that's one of the sweetest things, right? And by way of inspiration, it made me realize that when you restore these materials and you go through all of the technology, at the end of the day, what you have is a story. You have writing, literature, communication, and that is where the power is. Let me give you another example of digital restoration, one that we came to after we did the Iliad work with the power of layers. The Chad Gospels is an early Latin Vulgate New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and part of Luke. It was actually damaged and part lost during the during the early, I think, 15th, 16th century war, and someone was trying to save it, and by doing that probably lost part of it. But anyway, it's in the Lichfield Cathedral, central England, venerated by the church, and we had the chance to digitize it. And the digital copy that you're looking at shows the state that it's in. It's badly damaged. And so we started imagining after the digitization project, what would happen if we were able to take high-resolution imagery like this and then turn, say, an artist loose with a layer that represented a restoration. That might be interesting for people to be able to see back and forth restoration versus damage. And it might also be interesting for educational purposes so that people could understand the beauty of these things that largely is lost from antiquity because we just don't have access and because the damage is so bad. So layers supporting visualization and also restoration. We played around with that a little bit and also at times longed for other people to be interested more in digital restoration than in physical restoration because physical tampering is irreversible. So let me conclude my layering part of this talk by just saying early work revealed for us some principles that we thought were really interesting and still stand. Layers are a great way to visualize certain things. Image-based alignment is a computer science piece of making that happen, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second. And then it supports the idea of ongoing digital restoration, which can be great for scholarship, for visualization, for education, and even for inspiration. And for those of you who are going to be interested in hanging around later, if you want to talk tools and technology, we have a ton of things that we've done with various off-the-shelf components and also software we've released if you're interested in that, we could talk about. Let me give you a quick example from the Chad Gospels of layers at work. So we imaged in 2010, and the next earliest facsimile was 2003. It was done by the British Library as part of an exhibit called Turning the Pages. And these two image sets did not line up at all. They were done under completely different conditions with different equipment. And because the pages are flexible, the dimensionalities didn't line up either because the pages, in fact, are not exactly flat. So we implemented a non-rigid alignment process, which you're going to see here as a visualization. This is a video that's actually playing, and what's happening is that I'm running an optimization to make non-rigidly one of the images align slightly and fit onto the other image perfectly based on the features. This is running in a loop, so every 5 seconds you should see it run again where basically one of the images jitters and then settles in, and then the alignment is perfect. So we actually completed this work, and we took all 5 historical image sets of the Chad Gospels. It's been imaged 5 times throughout all of history in the last 100 years. And we aligned every one of the pages to our 2010 digitization. It's been released on the internet, and you can go and take a look at what those look like through time. So there's a lot of power in being able to visualize data like that. Okay, part 2. It turns out not everything is flat, so making it into a layer, has its challenges. In fact, if you pop up the dimensionality, let me just call this wrinkles. And I don't mean really wrinkles on me, but there have been some wrinkles. This was late 90s, British Library, Cotton Collection. And you can see even in this manuscript that I'm holding, which has been restored from damage that happened a few hundred years ago in the Cotton Collection at the British Library, you can see that the parchment held in paper frames is not flat. It has tons of cockles and wrinkles and creates a real challenge for digitization. Early work in this regard by me and my team developed an electronic facsimile of, first of all, the Beowulf, This project was led by a medieval scholar at the University of Kentucky, and I was pulled in as an early technical consultant and advisor to the graduate student who actually implemented this beautiful system for the 1995 Macintosh. So you can just imagine the glory of this, running on your desktop on a CD and communicating by a computer network. It was amazing, right? And a precursor to what we can do now, of course. Looks a little bit like Child's Play as we look back. But what we did in the process was we identified a lot of really interesting things that became challenges that we wanted to solve. And one of the challenges was that when you image these manuscripts and they're not flat, you create a fair amount of distortion in the images because the wrinkles are there, but you're pretending through photography that they're not. And we thought that maybe was unacceptable, so we built a system to try to capture the photography and the shape at the same time. And we applied this system in prototype to manuscripts from the Cotton collection, and then we were ready when we went to the Marciano Library to apply a full prototype system for every page of of Homer's Iliad, the Venatus A. And you're seeing my staffer digitize one page to create a shape model. And now you can see the photography pasted on top of the shape model to give you the sense of the actual 3D shape of the page. But beyond that, we were able to build a restoration pathway because that data gave us exactly the disposition of every page. And then we could go ahead and build a flattening mechanism that took the distortion out of the page and created an image for us which doesn't exist in real life, but an image that has the distortion removed from the fact that the page is not flat. We called this digital flattening or shape restoration, and it became one of our long-term principles for making digital copies of manuscripts. Would it be possible to capture shape, visualize that shape, and then also create facsimile that tries to remove the distortion from that shape so that you can end up with a manuscript image that looks flat? And we developed some tools for that and mapped that all back down onto layers, because once things are flattened out, then layers make sense as a visualization. So let me show you from this wrinkled restoration some examples. Left is photography with no distortion removed. Right is the image that comes from the flattening. And you can see that naturally the lines become linear again. To the first approximation, it's a pretty good way to pull out that distortion. If I take that 3D model and I turn it on its edge, skew it so that you can see it in 3D, and then show you the restoration and the non-restoration, you see very nicely how shape gets pushed flat, which is the way the scribe originally wrote the manuscript. I mean, I don't think that they actually wrote on the skin while it was still on the animal. They actually took it off and flattened it, and they wrote it when it was flat. So here's another example of a fairly profound cockle that gets removed by the flattening. Yeah, and one little note, if you look at the bottom of this image, on the left, you see that the curve is not linear. And on the right, that curve becomes a line. Through the flattening process, what was linear should become linear if you're doing it right. And so in these examples where the paper frames had been scribed with a rectangle that was nice and linear, we could have a sort of a self-check that the restoration was actually giving us the linear results that we expected. All right, so part 3, which will take the most time in our talk today, is unwrapping. Because full 3D is where you have to be if you're going to talk about something like a complete Herculaneum scroll that can never be unwrapped. I began working on the full 3D problem in sequence with this other work in the early 2000s. And so you can see my young, eager self in Naples, actually, here in this shot, where in 2004 I first became aware that Herculaneum was a thing. So I'm a computer scientist, and I knew that Vesuvius was a thing, and that Pompeii was a thing, but I had never heard of the Villa of the Papyri or these manuscripts from Herculaneum until I met Richard Janko, University of Michigan, and he took me to Naples to show me the collection at the Biblioteca Nazionale there. And that was when I began to study the sequence of events and the wreckage that took place because of the explosion of Vesuvius CE 79. And that is also when I began to descend into the wreck of Herculaneum lore, which has captured many a scholar before me and probably will capture more after. It's profound damage, one thing that you're talking about. The scrolls that have been physically opened, it's really been a disaster. And there's a large community, a fairly sizable community of scholars around the opened collection. And what they do is they try to go ahead and read the carbon black writing that's on these open manuscripts and then in fragmentary way put them together so that you can have entire stories, entire tomes. And it was in the early to mid 2000s that I jumped into this milieu and asked the question, would it be possible to do something digital here? I understand that the fundamental constraint of being able to digitize these things needs to be challenged, but maybe there's a way. And so I built a prototype, and I used for that prototype what was available to me at the time, and that was from medicine. So mid-century, mid-20th century, tomography was being developed, and in the late 70s, a Nobel Prize actually was awarded to the inventors of computed tomography and the medical systems that emerged from that work. And I'd become familiar with tomography through the medical community. So the first example that I did was one in the University of Kentucky's Medical Center using fairly coarse but accurate computed tomography, medical grade. And you all remember the hope of the year 2000, right? Well, in computer science, there was also the fear of Y2K. You guys remember that? Well, what I was actually thinking about at Y2K was tomography and the possibility of seeing inside something to the degree that we could actually read it without opening it. It's a completely non-invasive technique, and for inanimate objects, you're talking about some real power in terms of resolution and sensitivity to see what's inside without ever opening it. Okay, so here's your challenge. This was the data that I collected in that machine from this object I had created. There's writing on it, and so I ask you, what does it say? Okay, so we have a computational problem as well as a scanning challenge, right? Because the data is not in the right form to be able to read what's there. So the prototype we developed took everything that we'd done from wrinkles, where we were pushing things flat, and popped it up another dimension into 3 dimensions so that we could basically unfurl as opposed to just push flat. So I took that data from the previous slide and I put it into 3 dimensions, and you see the red beads at the top. I held those steady while I allowed gravity to unfurl this flag of data, and viewed in this way, we can now create an actual image where you see writing. And I don't know if it was from lack of confidence or inability to imagine, failure of imagination, but what I wrote on this first artifact was a series of wiggly lines, essentially. Yeah, so that's what we were able to get out of the data, complete unwrapping, start to finish, and this was the original first artifact. So, at the time, this was just part of the sequence of what we were working on. I didn't realize that I would be able to use this a decade and a half hence to be able to talk about, some other things, but there you go. This launched a long sequence for me of artifacts in the lab to try to perfect the steps that were required, both at scanning time and in software, to be able to do this so that we could actually get from scanning to stories. Another example here is an attempt to get around the idea of damage rather than simple scanning and unwrapping. What happens when the object you're going to scan and unwrap is also damaged? So we probably burned about 500 pieces of papyrus in Jessamine County, Kentucky in total as we tried to get the cocktail for carbonization correct. You have to have the right heat, the right amount of vacuum. It has to cook for the right length of time. I just want you to know it's pretty much a miracle that anything from the Villa of Papyri survived at all. It truly is a miracle. And I'd just like to make the remark that it may be the thing the only thing that could have saved it, to be honest. That perfect cocktail of heat and preservation because it's the only library from antiquity that survives. So it's pretty amazing. What we did with this work is we, in the lab, tried to simulate that. And here is the data from that. And I'm playing this data for you as a movie, seen as slices front to back. I'm not showing you the 3 dimensions as a block of 3D data. I'm showing you this as a movie where the 3rd dimension is time. But what you're actually seeing is a slice through that scroll at the front end, and then a slice as it moves through. And that's why the wraps show you the structure of how the papyrus is coiled. But you also see on those wraps the nice contrast that comes from the ink, and that is the signal that we would like to try to extract to be able to read what's there. So if I take a slice through that example and isolate one of the letter forms, after full unwrapping, this was the kind of result that we were getting for the pipeline that we had constructed in the mid to late 2000s. So you can see the letter form, and you can also see very strong fiber pattern from the papyrus itself, indicating a good extraction of where we should be, because you should be able to see the substrate fiber as well as the writing. And this led us to a framework that we were able to outline for how we thought this problem could be completely solved. Some kind of non-invasive volumetric scanning, micro CT fitting the bill, followed by computer science manipulation, basically algorithmic manipulation of that data until final unwrapping resulted. All right, I may have lost some of you because of the difficulty that I find most people have in understanding tomography first time around. So I helpfully put together a video that I think will give you an intuition that will be helpful for the rest of the talk. So I want to play this video, and I want to thank my son who spent 2 days shooting this stop motion video for your enjoyment. So let me play this.
For thousands of years, people have written on scrolls. The scrolls can contain historical records, religious texts, or stories, but many of them have been damaged over time. For example, the En-Gedi scrolls, found near the Dead Sea, were in a building that had burned down, leaving the scrolls charred, blackened, and brittle. But since the En-Gedi scrolls would crumble to ash if opened, how can we ever unlock their contents? There is, in fact, a way to read scrolls without damaging them. Imagine for a moment that a baker has 2 types of dough. The white dough represents papyrus, and the red dough represents ink. Using the red dough, the baker can create a pi symbol on the white dough. When the baker rolls up the dough, the pi symbol is obviously no longer visible, just like when papyrus is rolled up. Imagine the effects of time and the environment are this oven, baking the pastry for 1,000 years. If the pastry were still soft, the baker could simply unroll it, but now it would break and the information would be lost. The baker can, however, slice the pastry and decode the message from the traces of red dough in each slice. Using sophisticated technology, it is now possible for the scrolls to be digitally unrolled without ever damaging the scroll. It's important for damaged scrolls containing unique, ancient information to be both physically and digitally preserved. There are many ancient scrolls which are too damaged to read, but likely contain historically enlightening information. Digitization and virtual unwrapping allow us to view this otherwise inaccessible information.
Thanks also to my daughter who did the voiceover. The price was right for that. So that last sequence took, a half a day to shoot, and this is an example of a totally destructive technique, actually, because we sliced that thing up and photographed it. Every one of the slices so that we could take those photographs then and build the volume. The miracle of microcomputed tomography is that it non-invasively creates those slices at whatever resolution that you want. and then you can work from those slices and leave the real object aside. And I should say that I have had an interesting relationship with totally destructive evaluation as well as non-destructive. We actually took a book, and you're seeing it edge on, and we photographed that book after milling about 100 microns off of the front edge, and then we photographed it, and then we milled another 100 microns, and we went all the way through the book that way. And because I wanted to see what that data set would look like. Those of you who are familiar with the visible human will know that that's exactly how that data set was created on a cadaver. So medical folks are very familiar with this. This is what the data set looks like. Each one of the frames you're seeing as I mill off the front end of the book is 100 less microns of material. And can you see the writing in there? It's actually visible edge on. That axial view is exactly what tomography gives you. But you cannot read the words in the axial form. You have to flip that data so that you can see it in the in-plane form. So here's the movie of that same data flipped. And as you go through the frames of this, the data's been flipped, so now you're actually descending in the page through the book. And what you'll be able to see as this movie plays is that although I haven't segmented the layers so that they're exactly accurate, you will see the writing and the letters come in and out. And actually in about, I don't know, a few more seconds, you'll actually see illustrations go by, because all of that is on the page and it's all seen axially, and then when I turn it, you can actually see the writing. So if you would allow me to take a Herculaneum scroll and shave off 50 microns, photograph it, another 50 microns, and then give you back the complete ashes, I believe we could probably read what's there, but that isn't going to work. In fact, after all the work, I made a pitch to the Institut de France to be able to access the scrolls in their collection. And they agreed through a generous partnership with Daniel Delattre on the left and Madame Pastereau, the librarian, on the right. The head of the Academy permitted me in 2009 to make the first ever tomographic analysis of a Herculaneum scroll. And we did that. We took this scroll and one other, and we collected that data with an off-the-shelf, commercially available machine, and in 2009 made the study. We discovered a fair amount of really interesting stuff and made a presentation at the Academy in Paris in French, which I might add was one of the most terrifying days of my life, because I do speak French, but not very well, and I certainly don't speak high academic French, although I read from a transcript that day. It was really the only talk I've ever given where I seriously considered just running. Just running. I don't know if any of you have ever had one of those moments, but that was mine. I gave that talk, and part of the talk was that I believed that there might be impurities in the ink that we didn't expect, where we could see it in the tomography. I believed we might be able to use multiple powers registered to see the tomography effect for the ink. And I also believe there might have been some kind of shape information in the way this scroll deformed through the carbonization process. Basically, nobody'd seen the insides of one of these before through tomography, and we were the first to do that. It was really exciting. And it was also one of the most tedious preparation periods that I've ever done, because you can see here Madame Carew handling one of the scrolls with Daniel Delattre in the background. Of course, I never touched the objects. What we're doing here is we're actually making a form-fitted, we're actually scanning the external shape with lasers so that we can make a form-fitted case. And the run-up to the scanning required that we managed the transport and the handling of the object while it was being scanned so that there wasn't any undue stress on the object. And so to do that, we built a form-fitted case from the model of the shape of the exterior of the scroll. And these two scrolls, I named them facsimile because they were basically supposed to be the exact shape of the two scrolls in the collection, and we used the facsimile as a way to build the form-fitted case. This was a little bit before the easy pipeline for 3D printing, So what we would do now is a complete analysis of the exterior shape, and then we'd print a form-fitted case after a certain amount of processing. But we also developed code names for these two scrolls because they became our friends. This one was Banana Boy. And this one I named Fat Bastard basically because with a volcano for a mother and an unknown father, you know, it's really pitiful. And what we generated from these two facsimiles was a 3D model, of course, and then the ability to build the case. And that run-up, you know, I just, as an aside, mention it because there are all these little things in doing this kind of work that you don't anticipate that end up taking a fair amount of time. So there was a 6-month period, basically, of back and forth to be able to build the cases to the satisfaction of the conservators. So there is Banana Boy and its facsimile. And if you want a quick tour to be able to build the molds, I worked with a sculptor who understood everything about mold making so that we could take the facsimile and then build the inverse mold and then cast from polyurethane and cut down that polyurethane the actual container that would be used to protect and house the thing. And here's an early prototype. Although originally I was a little bit concerned about showing the one with the wooden base that I made in the table saw in my own home, I'm actually quite proud of this prototype because it got us to the point where we had a really nice design that everyone was really happy with. And that design is what went into the scanner in 2009 and gave us the first tomography of a Herculaneum scroll. This is Madame Carew inserting the item into the scan, which had to stand on its end and do a pirouette with the beam coming this way so that we could collect the full 360 and then do the tomographic reconstruction. And here is what the first radiograph that came off that machine looked like. You can see the case, the polyurethane, small polyurethane bubbles. The dark spot that goes vertically is the seam of the case, a little bit more dense. And if you take a look right up here, can you see any kind of light striping up in this area? That's our closure mechanism. Rubber band. Okay. This is what the first slice looks like. Yeah, let me just let you appreciate what we saw. Again, played for you like the jelly roll, a slice at a time, but now at 25 micron resolution with the core of probably 50 or 100 wraps around this tortured thing. All right, how many of you think that the software I had developed to that point was capable then of finding individual layers, following them, developing an unwrapping method for this data? Here is the data we had been looking at in my lab. Yeah. So reality often turns out to be, you know, a little bit more interesting and complicated and challenging than you might think. And so we got this data back to the lab, and of course there's a lot of eagerness in local press for sure, and all my leadership at the university, you know, and they were asking, you know, when are you going to convert this into the, you know, the classical text we've all been waiting for? What about the writing? And it actually took us 6 months of compute time just to redo all of the reconstructions that we'd tried to do on site, because computationally we needed a cluster to do the tomographic reconstruction and develop the 6 or 8 data sets, canonical data sets that we wanted to have. So before we could even do any analysis, we had 6 months worth of compute time and registration and alignment. But in that time, the press being the press, they were actually really interested in the result and wanted to know when we were going to read these scrolls. And so if you today Google seals stymied, my name is forever linked because they wanted to know. They wrote the article. I really can't argue because we were at a juncture in the work. We developed a lot of principles and a lot of tools, but we as yet did not have the capability to do the full analysis on a data set like that we really wanted to have. So here are the principles that had been developed to that point. The scanning was maturing, and when I started the work, didn't exist. We built our own first scanners in the lab, but quickly abandoned that as commercial entities came through with viable technology. We also worked on segmentation, which is the problem of finding and following the layers through that volume, but we didn't have a method that could anywhere, without a lot of effort by hand, solve the problem you've seen. And then all of the visualization, the flattening, the alignment, all of those things were there. And we began the build of what we hope will ultimately become the canonical tool set for this work, what we call volume cartography. And that's going to be released into the open source sometime this summer if and when my NSF project ends. But basically, to conclude this part of the story, let me say that we took everything that we'd done, Daniel Delattre and I, and wrote it up in 2013 and published it in Cronache Ercolanese, the top journal in all things Herculaneum. And I was really proud of this article. I did it while I was at Google on sabbatical in 2012-13. And at the close of the article, I went ahead and suggested the thing that I had been working on for 2 years at that point, which was that I believed a more sensitive tomographic method might give us exactly what we want in terms of resolution and ink response, and that would be phase contrast tomography, which I had learned about a few years prior through Slack and a scientist at Stanford. So, a little bit of a gap in the story, and I want to point to you to the New Yorker article. How many of you guys were able to read the article in the New Yorker? Some fascinating stuff, and I think John Seabrook did a great job. He spent a lot of time on this article, and I'll just spoil the end because I just hated the way the story ended. This was the end of the story, the last sentence. I do not expect this scroll will be read during my lifetime, Delattre said finally. He closed the lid of the small box with both hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Okay. Well, you guys are in the Midwest. I'm from Kentucky. You know, we don't slump in defeat. Maybe Daniel does that, but this was actually an inspiration for me to continue my work, to go from layers, wrinkles, and unwrapping to restoration and discovery. What was happening at the time that John was writing that article about Herculaneum was that we were also working on another data set that had come from En-Gedi. So I want to turn to the scroll from En-Gedi, and you see that I'm looking at the materials more from a geometric and software point of view than from their contents, because of course this scroll is not going to be a classical text from a classical library in Naples. This is going to be a text that was found in a holy synagogue, right, in the Dead Sea. But geometrically, you see many of the same problems. I'm showing you a slice, and I'm highlighting some of the slices that our software is actually helping us follow, segment, and then texture. And we worked on this for probably 3 or 4 months, and that was all it took for us to be able to get a core result, which I will show you now, and this was the first result from the En-Gedi scroll, 2015. And you see there a fair amount of distortion. That's because that texture is coming from a surface that's actually wrapped very tightly in 3D, and there's a crease there. You also see that there are missing spots. This was all we could segment at the time. But when Penina Shore, the director of the Dead Sea Scroll Project for the Israel Antiquities Authority, when she called me up and said, when she sent me an email and said, would you give me a report on progress, this was the image that I sent because it was what we had at the time. And she immediately sent back an email. You won't believe what groundbreaking discovery you've made. It's still all hush-hush because we want to have a press conference about it next week. Yeah. What you have deciphered is first chapter of the book of Leviticus, known text. After the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's the earliest Bible ever found. We already have it carbon dated to the 6th century CE, which was what she thought at the time, and it turns out that the carbon report was misread, and it's actually 3rd century CE. And if that's not enough, it's the first time ever a Bible's been found within an excavated synagogue. So in fact, we did have the 2015 press conference on the strength of that single result. that little core part that we were able to pull from that data set. You see Penina on the left, Sefi Parath in the middle, who was the original excavator, the archaeologist who pulled that artifact from the ground, and on the right, David Merkel, who did the scan. And then you see me behind on a Skype conference, standing in my office with my 3 team members like little angels on my shoulders, speaking truth into my ears as need be. Happily, Skype ran for a full hour without crashing, and we did an international press conference on that day, Kentucky and Jerusalem together. So it was a really exciting point, but for me, it was only the start of the story of the En-Gedi scroll, because what we'd realized is that we had a super high resolution data set, less than 18 microns, and that the artifact itself was actually really small. I didn't even know the scale of the artifact because the data had been delivered to me remotely and digitally. I'd never seen the actual scroll. I'd only seen photos. It's a miracle of the digital age that collaboration can happen this way. It wasn't until later that I went to Jerusalem and actually saw the real thing in the collection. But again, a miracle of survival. I mean, this thing that looks like so little, it looks like not much. In fact, it's ugly to the untrained eye. I see beauty. But to the untrained eye, it came from this hole in the ground 40 years ago and then sat in an archive. So in the time from the discovery to the work in 2015, 45 years passed. And then in those 2 years, we had our initial discovery and a press conference, and then we
Virtual
had
unwrapping begins by acquiring a 3-dimensional volumetric scan of the damaged manuscript. This scan produces a set of cross-sectional images that show the internal structure of the scroll. When viewed as a 3D object, one can clearly see the individual layers of the scroll, but any text on the surface of those layers is obscured from view. In order for a readable version of the scroll to be produced, these images must be passed through our virtual unwrapping pipeline. First, we capture the 3D shape of the layers of the scroll in a process called segmentation. On the left side of the screen, the software moves through the scroll, image by image, tracing the shape of a single scroll wrap. On the right, we see the 3D model that this produces. Next, we extract the ink from the data in a process called texturing. Using the 3D shape generated by segmentation, our software makes another pass through the scroll, this time looking for very bright pixels. Bright pixels indicate regions of dense material, in this case, inks made with iron or lead. We now have a single wrap of the scroll with the text shown clearly on its surface. However, because the surface is curved, it's difficult to read all of the text from one viewpoint. The flattening stage of our pipeline converts this textured 3D surface into a flat plane so that the text can be more easily read. To produce the best results, these 3 steps must be performed on one small section of the scroll at a time. As a result, we end up with several texture images that must be merged together. This merging process creates a single consolidated image that shows the full text. Using this pipeline, we have restored and revealed the text of 5 complete wraps of the En-Gedi scroll. The 2 distinct columns of Hebrew writing reveal the scroll to be the book of Leviticus. This marks the En-Gedi scroll as the earliest copy of a Pentateuchal book ever found in a holy ark, a significant discovery in biblical archaeology.
So again, thanks to my daughter for that free narration. So we developed a complete solution pipeline, and with the En-Gedi scroll, we're able to push a complete example all the way through. From layers to wrinkles and then to unwrapping. It's been a fairly long process for us to get to the point where we believe that virtual unwrapping is ready for prime time. That solution pipeline is part of what I published in the paper in Science. Because any solution, I believe, has to start with some kind of volumetric scanning that will show contrast at ink. Micro-CT, other methods possible, but it has to be volumetric, it has to be non-invasive. Then we have to find solutions to these other problems because it's strongly geometric. If you search for ink anywhere, you're actually going to be able to find things that look like writing, but it won't be writing. When you see that segmented leaf with the writing on it, does anyone in here doubt that that is actually writing? No one does. Because the writing, as opposed to a single letter form, is actually very systematic. It lines up in columns. It's intentional. There's design behind it. Lines up in columns. It follows a geometric pattern. Even if you can't make out individual letter forms, which we can, You can tell that it's a systematic, intentional marking as opposed to noise. So you'll see in our paper these items identified, and these pieces are separable, which means that people can work on them independently and improve them. And so our data is in the public domain. Anybody who can segment better the result can possibly produce better scholarship or a better result because the segmentation's improved. Same with texturing, flattening, merging. So I want to move into the epilogue, where I have a little bit more information for you, and then I'll finish. I think I have a little bit more time. And I want to frame this for you as actually one of my dreams, that actual virtual unwrapping is possible. And I also want to show you that it's still challenging and why I think it is. Okay, so first of all, let's just put this actual discovery in the right context. This particular scroll from En-Gedi and the discovery of it. We've dated it by carbon dating to about 300 CE, which is past the end of the Dead Sea Scroll era and the Second Temple period, but well before, for example, the Cairo-Geniza. In fact, Dead Sea Scrolls, which extend, maybe to 1st century generously, probably are closer to this scroll in nature than Byzantine works. And yet, because it sits in this period of silence, almost 800 years of very, very little information, it becomes very interesting from that point of view. And I'll say more about the text itself and its analysis in a minute, but just in terms of the timeline, Chad Gospels is about CE 730, predating Cairo by a little bit. What we did when we published our paper on the technology is that we co-published with the biblical scholars an analysis, a scholarly analysis of the scroll as well. And I love the culture. It's really interesting to learn how biblical scholarship works as opposed to computer science and technology. They really wanted to title this preliminary publication because these things take time to become settled. And the scholarly community talks about it, and they debate it, and they actually challenge each other. And this is where my talk is going to get a little bit more uncomfortably exciting, because I'm also going to do some of that challenging today, because we have another speaker who's going to follow me, and so this should be kind of interesting. Uncomfortably exciting is a term I picked up at Google from Larry Page, and it just means that there's great enthusiasm, but there are also uncomfortable periods where you have to challenge, and you have to try and test and confirm and trust and verify. In this publication, which I'm also co-author of, what you'll find is that our primary image that we computed, which we called the master image, was good enough at 1500 DPI to provide a full transcription from the images. And that transcription was good enough to support biblical scholarship, comparison, for example, of this text to the Masoretic text, the unsettled Essene text in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. And it was also good enough to support paleographic analysis. And so this paper actually has an appendix by Ada Yardeni, who does a paleographic analysis and actually wants to date the scroll slightly earlier than the carbon dating highest probability, which I think is also really, really very interesting. So we co-released these two papers on the same day, and you can find this one out there. Okay, so I want to go back to Herculaneum and say, okay, what about Herculaneum? When I wrote up all our results with Daniel DeLatre in 2013, and I suggested phase contrast would be the next step and could hold promise, I wasn't just suggesting that so that other people could do that. I was suggesting it so that hopefully I would be able to do that. And in the time from that article appearing to the New Yorker article appearing, some of you may have read the New Yorker article, and you read, late that fall, DeLatre brought 2 fragments and a complete scroll packed in the foam case that Seals had designed. However, Seals would not be traveling there with them. And so DeLatre took the scroll from Paris to Grenoble, and our colleague and his team scanned it in the synchrotron beam using phase contrast tomography. I was not there. So there's a lot of space in the narrative to try to understand, well, why wasn't I there? And then you also read that John wrote, Brent Seals denied the scientific glory of being the first to see inside the rolled scrolls, had been focusing on the software side. So let me just remark that I don't think I actually have been denied any glory at all. The 2009 work was a glory of itself, and it was the first time anyone had seen inside a Herculaneum scroll. And, you know, if there is glory to be had in this kind of work, what other glory is there than the En-Gedi scroll and its complete revelation to the world? So I think, though, what John was talking about is the fact that this article appeared after that scan was done by our colleague, the lead author, and you're going to hear him talk about this work. And you can see that I am not a co-author on this paper, and I wanted to be a co-author on that paper. So there was a dispute, and I was angry about it for a while, because I facilitated the experiments that were done in the synchrotron. One way I facilitated them was that I actually sent the case that I had built so that the scroll could be transported and so that it could be safely handled for those experiments. You remember that that case was built in 2009 and used for my team during that era. So now, to make sure that we're all suitably uncomfortable, I'm going to point out just a couple of things and then I'm going to conclude my talk. This image is actually from that scan session and appeared in the paper on which I am not a co-author. And this is meant to be writing. I affectionately refer to this particular example as hey, because I am not a Greek scholar. The surrounding images I've pulled out are images that I've pulled from my own data that also look like letters, but I know for sure that they're not writing, because there's nothing systematic about them at all. You can't really push, when you look at the geometry locally to those areas, you can't push that out to be able to find the correct geometry unwrapping pipeline that would give you the full writing. So I'm dubious about this as being a letter form at all. And you may say, well, what about things that look like a complete sequence of letters? And so here you have another result from that work. That looks kind of like what's claimed to be piptoia or a Greek word. But, you know, again, I can find many sequences in my own data that look in the small like they might be writing. Not convinced they are. So, an aside, I actually launched a project over the past few years to basically do random searches through a volume for where you give me a target and I'll find you a spot that looks like that. It's a standard computer vision problem. You give me a template of any letter. It can be Klingon, or if in this case you just want to find, you know, an O, an omicron, a curve. And it turns out that I can basically build up an entire alphabet for you pretty easily from the scrolls, but none of it is writing, right? And those of you who affectionately have seen the butterfly alphabet know that in the wings of a butterfly it can be found every one of the letters of the English alphabet, but none of them form any real words and certainly not stories. So let me show you what I expect to be the standard for scholarship in this area. Because after all, we're asking you to trust that we're doing a non-invasive scan of something you can't see, will never be opened, and then I'm going to produce something that I say it says. And you have to believe me? Really? Well, here's how we make that actually, we put that on firm scholarly footing. This example shows the data on the top, where I've outlined the layer that I'm going to follow, and then the surface that's built from that layer on the bottom. And you notice that, can you see my cursor? Yeah, over here, if I get off of the layer, what I create here is a result that's black, right? Because I'm sitting in space, not on the layer. Now, if on the other hand, I correctly follow the layer, I start at the right place, and I end at the right place. Can you see this nice Greek letter form? You see this nice crack in the surface, and if I go back and forth, you see that one of those gives me exactly the letter, and one of them does not. You basically have to create in this work a pipeline, a sequence of geometric transformations that can get you from what you're claiming is writing back to the original data in terms of a transformation pipeline. And then that has to be available for scholars to critique. If we don't have this, then basically what you have is me saying, I saw Leviticus inside a scroll, and everybody just, I guess, salutes, and then that's it? I mean, I don't think so. I think what actually happens is that you get this data, and then you follow this point to a point on a 3D surface to a point in a volume, and you verify that all of the contributing voxels are actually properly contributing to the texture that I think is being seen there. So you're going to find when you look at my paper that all of our materials and data that we use to create that master texture are available to the public. And there's a link there so that you can find all of that material and download it. It's all available, not just the raw data, but actually all of the subsequent processing that we did, the geometry, its exact location in the volume. And with the right tools, you're inspired and able to go ahead and look at every one of those texture claims and decide for yourself if it's actually a real texture, if it's actually a real word, and if we've actually read anything at all. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And let me also say that there are tons of other materials that are sitting out in archives that are ripe for us to be able to do this work. Here is a manuscript, medieval manuscript from an accidental bombing actually that happened in World War II, museum connected to the Cathedral of Chartres near Paris. And these materials, it's just wrenching to see, that nothing can be done with them, and they're probably conservation-wise never going to be opened. So devastation. Well, we recently had a chance to go ahead and put one of these into a scanner, and this is what it looks like when you take a slice. So you can see the tortured nature of the internal structure, but you can also see these gray areas where there's contrast at ink, and therefore there might be writing. And if you look at the volume as a visualization, you can see straight up in the volume word soup, right? There are words visible in there from the pages of those damaged manuscripts, but you need some way to reliably extract them. So with our software in 1 hour, we were able to go ahead and find a small patch, flatten it, and texture it. That's basically the process, and what we'd like to do with our software is inspire the community as a community to use our software, push the techniques forward, improve each of the components, and accept that we need to trust and verify so that any texture claim can be verified outside of the research group that generated it, so we can all be comfortable that the research is on solid footing. Let me show you one little peek into the science behind one of the steps of the pipeline that we've generated. And that step I'll focus on right now is flattening. When you take a damaged three-dimensional shape that's all twisted in 3D and you flatten it, you create distortion. We've been studying methods by which we can minimize that distortion and also visualize the degree to which we are distorting so that someone who's interested in the text and the paleography can understand the impact of that flattening on what they're actually viewing. So to go back to our unfolded En-Gedi scroll, you see that there are pieces highlighted in colors that were merged together. And that section that I showed you from the very first press conference was just this center section here. So all of this we did subsequently. But each of these things needs to be flattened separately and then merged together. That's how the process works. And so the flattening, if it creates distortion, can really cause problems. So I just want to point out that the flattening method, and here are 3 different methods that we've tried to be able to do a comparative analysis. And you see that you get different shape, and therefore the text and the letter forms are going to look different. Based on angle-based flattening or what I call material model flattening, and then this is a least squares method. And there are other methods as well, conformal maps. What we can do is we can actually visualize through an error metric exactly where error is being introduced, how much is being introduced, stretching, shearing, change in area, all of those kind of things. And we can provide this as a general guide for anybody who would be using this tool to try to piece together from a volume an actual text. We think it's actually pretty interesting and has some challenges as well. If you don't do this right, then what you end up doing is losing some nuance, especially on the boundaries, which is really bad for merging because the boundaries is exactly where you need all that information so that the merge can line everything up. So to show you the different methods borne out on my manuscript, the En-Gedi scroll, here is the complete manuscript with one method, and then here is what it looks like when you use the other flattening method. Slightly different shape, and therefore slightly different paleography, which in this context paleographers will have to get used to. An important nuance, but very interesting and place where we're doing continued work. All right, so now I'm going to finish by saying, where others see damage, I see hidden truth, hidden beauty. Some people don't believe there is truth and beauty anymore. That's not me. This is possibly Ezekiel. It's in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. It's never been opened. It's never been read. This is a manuscript, a sheaf of papers discovered on a cadaver in the Northwest Passage from Franklin's expedition. It's not been opened. It's in Greenwich Museum, England. We don't know if there's writing about what happened. I'd love to be able to read that. This is cartonnage. Tons of cartonnage out there. A lot of cartonnage is being taken apart. It's probably not the right thing to do, but rather inventing a method where we can non-invasively read what's there is the right thing to do. And we have the grand challenge of the Herculaneum collection. The ability to push one complete text all the way through the pipeline, as I have done with En-Gedi, is still elusive and is still a goal of mine. So I conclude by saying, revealing the invisible library is more than just seeing letters in ink. It has a number of steps that ultimately lead us to the ability to understand texts and read stories. That's the goal. So when you take the En-Gedi scroll, you see Leviticus chapter 1 and Leviticus chapter 2, and you see it to the degree that allows you to actually do letter form analysis at 1500 DPI. I can print that out for you to do the analysis at a fairly high degree of resolution rather than at scale. And this is Ada Yardini's trace, which she used to do the paleographic analysis, which is in the appendix of the second paper. If you're interested, you can find it. That's the goal. That's what we're looking for. That's where I want the dialogue to be. Is this a scholar's dream? Well, I would say it is. The dream is to redeem the truth and the beauty of a text, especially one that looks like it's nothing, and to do it from the invisibility at first, through geometry and through computation, to what we ultimately want, which is stories. Well, I've told a few. Now I ask for your questions. Thank you very much. Yes?
Is there a team trying to get you to read the Chartrain manuscripts? I'm speaking as a medievalist who'd like to know what's in them.
We went with the team and did the prototype and then found that we were unable to get permission from the French to go further. So we were eager and offered our services for free, but the French were unable to get the funding and apparently the will and the permission that they needed to go further. But it's an open prospect. And it's being done with a team at University of Rochester, Roger Easton and Greg. I'm forgetting Greg's last name, but yeah. Yes?
Brent, I just wanted to ask, for those of us who are novices in the room, which is probably all of us, could you say a little bit about the energy sources that are used to penetrate the scroll? And, I mean, clearly this is a non-invasive technique, but you're getting enough energy of some kind through the scroll that a detector on the other side of it can make these reconstructions. And I mean, is there any work that's been done to try to determine if there's any molecular change whatsoever that occurs to the original artifact?
Oh, you mean in terms of damage?
Well, yeah,
Or alteration? I mean, I'm sure there is alteration, right? Because everything fluoresces, and when that happens, there's tiny alteration. And I'm not a physicist, and I'm not a chemist. So probably the wrong one to give a definitive answer to that. But everything I've read and from everything people have done, there's a lot of work being done with non-invasive techniques on really important things.
Yeah.
You know, like XRF on paintings, which in terms of making something fluoresce, you're using a lot more energy typically, right? So I would say tomography is probably the least of the egregious things being done, where egregious now is way less egregious than just 20 years ago. In terms of energies, we use anywhere from 40 to 80 kV because we were the first to discover that there was lead in the Herculaneum ink, although micro amounts. A lot of people are interested in using energies that are around the K edge, alpha beta K edge of lead, which would be in this 60, 70 kind of range in terms of fluorescence. Don't need that much power to get through this papyrus typically, so it's really more about sensitivity and the composition of the ink itself. You had a question?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't understand any of the of the technical stuff, although it's extremely interesting to hear about it. But you know, you're raising this question about verification, right? So scholars have to believe that you have a technology that actually can do this, and what they're seeing is actually inside the scroll. So I think it's a very good point to make. But it seems that when you're producing a text that actually can be recognized as being from Leviticus, right? You don't read Hebrew, right? So you didn't know this until somebody looked at it, and you're not using any sort of OCR enhancement techniques. I mean, isn't that pretty good proof?
It's a self-verification, yes, but every small reading within that, where you're arguing about a possible erasure or a departure from the Masoretic text, you have to be able, in the small, to be able to go back. And you know, you're going to hear from my colleague later where the verification was done on small numbers of letters by a single scholar, and the data is not available. So you know, you have that, right?
I did have another sort of related question, I guess. And that is, I work with Chinese texts, although I don't really know any Chinese text that is in that sort of state where.
There is some National Palace Museum, yeah.
Right, yes. But anyway, what often is the case with the Chinese text is that people who read it have made notations in the margins.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so that would be very difficult to capture with your system, wouldn't it? Because you're saying you kind of to exclude things that are not actually writing, you have to follow it, right? You have to find it.
No, actually, if it's on the page,
deal with something that is written not in a linear form, maybe kind of like.
it should all be there. If it's on the page, it should be visible. Sure, the question there would be more about the composition of what those marginalia were written, and often they would use different inks than the main writing. And if it doesn't respond well, then it would be invisible or difficult to make visible. But on the other hand, if it's on the page, anything that's on the page is going to come out in tomography if you've done the geometry correctly. It's all about the geometry. Yeah.
Thanks, Brent. Very exciting. Makes me feel very optimistic.
No slumped shoulders up here, okay?
Could you comment a little bit more about why the En-Gedi unwrapping was so much more successful than the Herculaneum? Does it have any other factors like ink composition?
Yeah, sure. We believe the ink of Herculaneum is more challenging at the scanning level, that's for sure. There are micro amounts of lead, but very, very small, probably not enough to show density difference in straight tomography, which is why I don't believe my 2009 data set actually had contrast enough to be able to see the ink. So that's one thing. The counterpoint to that is that the En-Gedi scroll actually does probably have metal in the ink, which is very strange because it's really early for iron or lead to be in those quantities in that ink. We don't yet have a really good explanation for that, especially if Ada is right and it's actually first century. First century is really early from that area to have any lead or iron-based ink. So that's one thing. And then the second thing, En-Gedi scroll is animal skin. The layers are much thicker than the carbonized papyrus. So the segmentation problem was easier, and it was easy for us to solve, relatively speaking. It doesn't mean that we don't have a solution for the segmentation problem on Herculaneum. Actually, we do, and we've segmented large portions. But the segmentation doesn't help us if all we see are the fibers and we don't see contrast at the ink.
So in general, papyrus is much more difficult.
Well, when it's rolled like the Herculaneum stuff, we've done other papyri that actually are not hard to do because they're only looped 2 or 3 times and they're not carbonized. And uncarbonized papyrus still is a couple hundred, maybe 300 microns thick. That's 0.3 of a millimeter. And that thickness is easily obtainable on a 18 micron sort of CT scan. You can find it pretty easily. But the carbonization shrinks it. Yes?
I have a comment and then a question. The comment is, I like how, whether intentionally or not, you sort of drew a parallel between experimental archaeology and debugging. So you had to make all of these fake carbonized scrolls in order to debug your program and write it so that way you weren't debugging in production. So I thought that was cool. The question I had is, toward the beginning of your talk, you had the the simulated unrolling of the scroll that you said was the points were being dragged downward by gravity. Did you model the physics of like all the points being related to each other on the sheet, or how did you do that?
Yeah, so that was our first attempt at doing the flattening problem. It was purely to run a physics-based particle system, not unlike the computer graphics world, where they model clothing and hair and flags waving and all that for the purpose of generating images. So we basically copied that work, built a particle system, and then let it run. Of course, we've since upgraded to all of the different ways that you can do that mapping. But yeah, that was our first attempt. And to your point about debugging, part of it, I have to say, was pitch making. It's a computer scientist from Kentucky convincing someone in France to let them do anything with anything. And that's not going to just happen on one visit and with one conversation. So we made a lot of experiments in the lab to be able to make that pitch and develop those relationships. Yes?
Yeah, I'm very impressed with your work, I have to say, and like everybody else. Is the tomographic process being augmented in order for you to eventually be able to kind of unravel all of these 50 to 100 folds and actually read them? Because tomography wasn't developed for this purpose, but for other purposes, and I just don't know whether science is going to enable you to do that.
Well, those are completely separable problems. So the tomography gives you the unstructured volume. And the unwrapping problem, or the surface following problem, or if you want to call it just segmentation, is an important medical problem as well. I mean, doctors will often follow the capsule of an organ so that they can see the surface of that organ through the tomography. And the tomography doesn't give you that, right? It gives you just the unstructured slices. So we're working very much in a domain that is relevant to all the other domains where tomography is important. And I think it is solvable, actually, in a way that's almost completely automatic. I don't want to tip my hand too much because I would like to be able to publish my future work. So I'm hoping that happens for me. But we have methods that we think are going to make fully automated segmentation possible. So, yes?
It seems as though there might be some lurking commercial applications, but it also would appear that one of the gross issues would be duplexing. In other words, pages facing one another that have image on both sides.
Yeah, you're right. That's a tough problem. And we have the ability to bias the way we calculate the texture that's going to go on a surface so that we can eliminate one direction. We can be directional about that, and that helps the bias problem. But when you have facing pages and they're right up against each other with no space at all, you could get basically a combo image that includes two pages in one image. But honestly, if the worst thing that happens is that you end up following the seam between the two and you have to disambiguate between two pages, but they're very clear, that's probably a solvable problem at the next level up, I would guess. But you're right, that's very observant. And in Herculaneum and other kinds of early classical materials, usually it's one-sided and rolled, and so you don't have that problem. But if you go to manuscripts, from medieval period where you have these facing pages, you're going to see that for sure. Yes?
So you said the technology comes from originally the medical community. Has there been any kind of direction to, they're interested in what you're doing to apply it back to medical applications?
Absolutely. There's been a fair amount of back and forth. And, I'm not the only one working on non-invasive methods for, outside of medicine. There's a ton of work all over, from biology all the way to manufacturing, people seeing what they can do with tomography. But one example would be arterial analysis using tomography in the medical community. It's often the case that you're looking for the inner lining of an artery so that you can see if there's buildup. And it's actually not that easy in the data if you're just looking at the slices to see what you want to see. So we're talking about how the same kind of surface following with texturing could help you open that up and see in a better way exactly what you're looking for. So that's just one example, but there are numbers of examples where surface following, texturing, these flattening, these things play a role. Yes?
So when you're talking about identifying marks on a page, you're looking for that structure that would suggest your text. I'm curious if you've had any experience of identifying images or looking for non-textual marks and making some sense of them.
So we don't actually use the ink signature as part of our search. It's purely geometric. We march along the structure of the page because that's where you get a strong signal. The page in cross-section is going to show fiber pattern. And you can even tell in that fiber pattern how close to the surface you are. So we can construct what should be on that page from the data using, very careful parameters about how much of the page we want to include in that calculation, and even if we want to go into the air a little bit. So if there's an illustration on the page, it just pops out. My point about the writing is simply that when we get whatever we get from doing the texturing, writing is going to be systematic. It's not going to look like random stuff. And that's how we know that, it's going to be writing. I believe illustrations are going to be visible as well. So, for example, illuminations in a manuscript, we see those in the one from Chartres. The illuminations are there. Everything, though, the caveat is that everything comes through the lens of how the X-ray interacts chemically, physically, with whatever the construction of that ink is. That's what you end up with in the tomography. We're working on ways of amplifying that and making it much more sensitive, but that's the frontier, really. Typically, people have just looked at density. Phase is now coming on. It's fairly mature, but there's going to be more. And cause for excitement because, tomography really is like magic. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Other questions?
If there are no further questions, please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you.